The unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect truth is seldom met with, even in 100,000 myriad kalpas. Now we can see it, hear it, we can remember and accept it. I vow to make the Buddha's truth one with myself. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha. The four wisdoms, charity, tenderness, benevolence, and sympathy, are the means we have of helping others and represent the Bodhisattva's aspirations. I think you'll all recognize that's a line from the Shushogi, and the theme of this weekend's retreat has been awakening the mind of the Bodhisattva, and the four wisdoms play a central part in that. I want to talk about the four wisdoms. I want to do it, this is going to be an aerial view. I think you've probably been getting the up-close view earlier in the week. This is looking at them from above and seeing where they fit into the larger scope of Buddhist practice and teaching. Some of you will have heard some of this before, so I hope there'll still be something enough to hold your interest and be of benefit. Let me start with talking about the relationship of compassion and wisdom. It's interesting that we call these the four wisdoms because they're also acts of compassion. There's ways of cultivating and acting on compassion. My experience is that in compassion we can cultivate compassion. Okay? And we're given a lot of tools, and we'll talk about that. Wisdom is something that just kind of grows naturally. If you keep up the sitting, if you keep up the meditation, the wisdom just knows gradually. Wisdom grows naturally, and all of a sudden, someday you realize, I'm being able to respond to things in a good way, in a way I didn't even recognize I could. Okay. We illustrate this often in Buddhist iconography by Kanzeon being the depiction of great compassion, and wisdom is depicted by Manjusri. In a monastery like this, the image we usually have in the monk's meditation hall is Manjusri, is the Bodhisattva of wisdom. If you look in Zen's Eternal Life, there's a picture there of the meditation hall at Sojiji, where Reverend Master Jiyu trained in Japan, and you can see a picture of Manjusri sitting on the beast of self. Okay. In some Buddhist traditions, the roles are reversed. And Avalokiteshvara is male, okay, and represents skillful means or compassion. And wisdom is female. And we have a depiction of the female version outside the kitchen, there on the cloister. That's Prajnaparamita. Okay, that's the Buddha of great wisdom. So either system you use, you need both. All right? We need both compassion and wisdom. Another way that this is illustrated in Buddhist iconography, and Buddhist iconography is just, it's showing something about the teaching. It's helpful to remember that Buddhism developed before most people knew how to read. We're so fortunate we can read scriptures, we can listen to scriptures. Now we've got the internet. We just have this wealth of Dharma. But for most of Buddha's history, most people couldn't read, and so they would go to the temples, and the statues were teaching something. And another way this interrelationship of compassion and wisdom is taught is through the figure of Kanzeon, such as we have here in our side shrine. Kanzeon, in traditional depictions, always has a small Buddha in her headdress or crown. Okay? And it's a specific Buddha. Okay? It's not just a general, generic Buddha. Specifically, it's the Buddha Amitabha, and he's considered her spiritual father. Again, in that way of looking at these figures, he's the Buddha of wise discernment. He's the Buddha of wisdom. There's a set of 5 Buddhas, sometimes called the 5 jhani Buddhas or 5 meditation Buddhas. You find them a lot more in other traditions. For us, it's sort of in the background. It's not one of the things we have in the foreground. But there's 5 different aspects of wisdom. And Amitabha represents the wisdom of discernment. So right there, and he has his hands in the meditation mudra. Just our Buddha here doesn't have that, but just like we sit in meditation, he has his hands in the meditation mudra. So again, it's showing that interrelationship of wisdom and compassion. We need both. Okay, they interpenetrate. One of the ways that we can cultivate compassion, and again, this is why, as I said, compassion, we're given a lot of tools. And one of those tools is the precepts. Okay? Particularly the great 10 precepts. Those show us how to refrain from evil, how to cease from doing harm. Okay? The precepts are all grounded in compassion. If you look at each one, it's describing how to relate to other people, okay? How not to harm other people, okay? How to cease from harm, how to cease from creating suffering. Okay? And the 10 precepts are expressed in a sense of restraint. It's sort of like, we're driving along, and if you want to turn around and go the other direction, you have to put the brake on first. Okay, so the 10 precepts very much are like that brake. They're teaching us to restrain from acting in a particular way that causes harm so that we can then act in a positive way. We're also given a lot of tools for the positive attributes to cultivate. And the 4 wisdoms are one of those. It's interesting, the main tools we're given are the 4 wisdoms and the 6 paramitas. So you end up really with 10 precepts and 10 of these positive virtues, if that's an easy way for you to remember that. Okay? And I think it's interesting that the 4 wisdoms are called the wisdoms because they're trying to diminish that difference between compassion and wisdom. It's just one practice. Okay? I think another reason they're called the 4 wisdoms is that the original Sanskrit word is something like, translates literally as something like foundations of social unity. And that's quite a mouthful. Okay. And one of the ways I want us to look at the 4 wisdoms from an aerial point of view is what they've been called in different traditions down the centuries, okay, and contemporary. I think they may have called them the 4 wisdoms because that was just, in part, a handy word to use. Okay, instead of having to say the foundations of social harmony every time they wanted to talk about the 4 wisdoms. It's similar to the 6 paramitas. There's not a good English word for paramita, so we just end up calling them usually the paramitas. They're sometimes translated as perfection, but that's not really right because perfection is something that's brought to an end, and they're active. If we had the word perfecting as a noun, that would be a much better, but we really don't have that in English. So I think they called the wisdoms, the 4 wisdoms, 4 wisdoms in part because that was a handy word to use as well as express this interrelationship of compassion and wisdom. The Four Wisdoms are not something that Dogen just kind of came up with or created out of thin air. They go all the way back to the Buddha. And the Buddha said, this is how he expressed them: giving, endearing speech, beneficent conduct, and impartiality under diverse worldly conditions as is suitable to fit each case. These means of embracing others are like the linchpin of a rolling chariot. Okay, do you all know what a linchpin is? You know, we don't drive horses and wagons and buggies and chariots much anymore. But the linchpin was the pin that went through the axle on a cart or chariot that kept the wheel from rolling off, slipping off. So if you want to travel, you need that linchpin in place. If you really wanted to stop someone from traveling, you could, mischievously pull that linchpin out, and when they tried to travel, the whole chariot would fall over. Okay, so it's a linchpin. We really need that linchpin if we want to go somewhere. It's that central. It can seem small, but it's actually something quite important. So that's how the Buddha talked about these four wisdoms when he introduced them. And it includes, I think, my favorite way of talking about them, which is the four all-embracing virtues. Okay? They're all-embracing in that we embrace all. Okay? It's in keeping with our Mahayana tradition, the great vehicle that we train for others as well as self. All sentient beings. Okay? All embracing. I find the word embracing speaks to my heart in a way that some of the other translations don't. Reverend Master Ji taught us to use words that build faith. Okay, and I think embracing is one of those. Each translation has its merit. One translation is the four integrative methods. Well, I would rather be embraced than integrated. Okay? Okay. It has, but integrate gets at it too. But I think embracing is a word that gives us a sense for what it feels like to be embraced by the four wisdoms. Now, in Theravadan Buddhism, Southern Buddhism, these four wisdoms pop up again and again in different scriptures. One translation is called "The Four Grounds for the Bonds of Fellowship." Okay, they're all pointing to this is how we create a harmonious society, okay? Or any kind of community, or a marriage, a partnership, where one works in our world. Okay, they show us how to get along with each other, how we can harmonize and live with each other in a peaceful way. So the bonds of fellowship is one way it's expressed. Another way is the means of sustaining favorable relationships. Okay, we don't want to just initiate a good relationship. We want to sustain it. How do we sustain a good relationship with the people around us? A harmonious relationship. Sometimes they're called the elements of popularity. Okay? Well, yeah, you practice the four wisdoms, you'll probably find people liking you. Okay? They will. It probably make you popular. I don't know that we should practice them in order to be popular, but they certainly have that effect. Sometimes they're called the articles of attraction, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Another translation is the four conditions of social welfare. It's how we create a society that works together in such a way that we can all be at peace. One of the writings by a Theravadan teacher that I read about this made the point that in Theravadan Buddhism we emphasize the four immeasurables, the four Brahma Viharas, which are metta, compassion, rejoicing in the merit of others, and equanimity. Okay, and he makes the point that these are practices for cultivating particular states of mind. That's why they're called the Brahma Viharas, because Vihara means dwelling, and Brahma is one of the Indian gods. So when you practice these things, it's as if you're living in the dwelling place of the gods. It brings us that sort of bliss. Okay. But it's about one's own state of mind. Okay. And this teacher makes the point that the four wisdoms is what he calls the social virtues. They're about looking outward. They're the external expression of the four immeasurables. Again, it's how we express ourselves in practice, in life with other people. And in keeping with that, when in Mahayana Buddhism, which is again our northern branch that puts equal emphasis on others as well as self, emphasis on compassion, the emphasis shifts in the four wisdoms. Okay? And it makes the four wisdoms something more than just improving society. Okay? It makes it into a part of our practice. And it makes it a part of our practice as a bodhisattva. Okay? It makes it a part of our training to benefit all beings. And so when it's talked about in the four wisdoms, they come out expressed differently. As I said, my favorite is the four all-embracing virtues. Okay. Another is the four expedients, or skillful means, by which sentient beings feel themselves attracted to us. Okay, again, it's kind of that element of popularity. It's ways that people are drawn to the Dharma. I don't think we practice them in order to have that effect, but it does have that effect. Okay? And one of the ways that the four wisdoms are, again, described in pictures is that they're the four gatekeepers of the mandala. In a mandala, it's usually a square, and there's a gate in each side. And when Reverend Master Koten, our prior up in Canada, talked about the Buddha Mother Mandala, he talked about the four fierce ladies. Okay? These are the feminine figures who stand at each of the gates. And they're the ones who attract beings, because if you want to come into the mandala, you have to come in one of the gates. And they're the ones who stand at the gates and attract people, trying to get them to come in. And they hold various implements to help beings do that. There's one with a hook. Okay, like cartoon, hook, pull you. There's one with a bell. Okay, if you don't want to be dragged in, well, can you respond to a bell? There's one with a rope. Okay, lasso. And then there's one with a chain. If you're really a hard case, they'll chain you and drag you in. But they're the ways that people come to training. It's ways of awakening the bodhisattva mind in people. It's ways of awakening the Buddha-seeking mind, the mind that trains for self as well as other. I personally believe that's how bodhicitta arises. Bodhicitta is that mind that seeks for the enlightenment of others as well as oneself. I think you encounter someone who exhibits that quality. And I think that's why in Buddhism you have to encounter it personally. That there's something more that you can't get in a book. You have to encounter someone who's practicing. Now that was the case with the Buddha. He saw birth, he saw old age, disease, and death, and he saw someone who was practicing. Okay? I don't think it necessarily has to be a monk, but someone who's practicing, someone who's wearing the kesa, whether it's visible or not. Okay? That awakens the Buddha-seeking mind. And our scriptures make the point frequently that once that's awakened, it can't be put to sleep. Okay? Once that's been awakened, it will eventually lead to Buddhahood. We all have the Buddha nature. And once that's awakened, it's inevitable that we will all become Buddha. Sometimes called the prediction of Buddhahood. No matter what happens to us, okay? No matter how many times we may fall down, no matter how many times we may wander, how many times we may almost go to sleep, there's a part of us that's still awake, okay, and can be awakened. Wake up, wake up. That's why the Buddha is described as having an awakening. Okay, so another way that the four wisdoms are expressed in iconography is that they're represented by a Chalanata's rope. In our picture of a Chalanata, he holds a rosary or a rope. Again, it's ways of attracting beings to liberation, again, within bodhicitta. Okay? So you see the four wisdoms are just woven into all these pictures in all these different ways. Once you know it's there, it can be a reminder, oh yeah, I can be charitable. Oh yeah, I need to work on my speech a little more here. Another way it's expressed in the Avatamsaka scripture is called the four ways of saving people. Okay? Saving in the sense of leading sentient beings to liberation, leading beings to emancipation, okay? Leading beings to training in ultimate Buddhahood. Another way it's expressed in the Avatamsaka scripture is that it's how Avalokiteshvara takes care of sentient beings. Again, there's that sense of embracing, of helping, of holding. So I think you get the idea. Okay, the four wisdoms, they're social virtues. Virtue is kind of an old-fashioned word. We don't use it too much, and it's not always used in a very positive context anymore. But I looked it up in the dictionary, and again, what it means is moral righteousness or moral excellence. Again, that doesn't quite go over very well anymore. But the synonym is goodness. And I like that. The four wisdoms are the four goodnesses. Okay? It's the four all-embracing goodnesses. And we all know what goodness is. We all can recognize goodness. These virtues are not just for Buddhists. That's the nice thing about them. You can practice them in whatever context you're in. You don't have to wave your Buddhist flag and saying, I'm practicing charity here. Okay? Just be charitable. Be kind. Be generous. Okay, let's look at each of the four just briefly. Dana, or generosity, giving. I think it's hard to say something original about that. I think Dogen, in his writing on the Four Wisdoms, makes the point that everyone can give. Okay? It's not just something that the lay people do in order to support the monks. If you read his writing, it's quite clear as he talks about Dharma. Just read you what he says. When we have learned well what the offering of alms means, then we can see that accepting oneself and letting go of oneself are both offerings of alms. Earning a living and doing productive work have never been anything other than an offering of alms. Okay? This attitude of generosity. We can all do that. We can all do that in every context. Okay? We can have a generous heart. There's some teaching in the Tenzo Kyokun, Dogen's instructions to the chief cook. And there he talks about Daishin, great mind, a generous mind. It's as hard as a rock, as great as the ocean. Okay? The next wisdom, tenderness. Again, Dogen talks about this in the Tenzo Kyokun, and again gives us a good illustration for how to practice tenderness. He talks about parental mind. Okay? It's the mind of a parent that loves its child. The parent doesn't always say something that's pleasing to the child, but it does it out of love. It's parental mind, the caring, loving mind. He says in the Shushogi, one must speak to others whilst thinking that one loves all living things as if they were one's own children. Okay? This isn't patronizing. No. It isn't sentimental indulgence. But it's the true expression of love, as he says someplace, with concern for the long-term welfare of the person. We've got the long view. What's going to really benefit this person in the long run? And this is why, as a parent, you sometimes have to say no, because you know what the long-term consequences of something that on the surface, in the immediate now, seems awfully good. But the parent has to say no, because the long-term effect would be harmful. Okay? That's the mind of a bodhisattva. It's got the whole person, their whole life, holding that in mind. Not just in an immediate gratification of pleasure. Okay? Not just being nice. It's nice to be nice. But the bodhisattva goes beyond that. Okay? Then the third wisdom is benevolence. Benevolence, I had to look that up too. Means good or kind-hearted action. Okay? We don't want to just sound good. We want to be good. We want to act in a good way. In the Bodhisattva Shishobo, I'm probably mispronouncing that, but that's the chapter in the Shobogenzo that the little piece in the Shushogi on the Four Wisdoms is extracted from. In the Shobogenzo, Dogen has a whole chapter on the Four Wisdoms. And what we have in the Shushogi, in that one section is just an excerpt in a précis of it, a condensation. But I really encourage you to look at that sometimes if you can. But one of the things he says in there about benevolence is, it means that we take care of every kind of person, no matter whether of high or low position, for this gives our life merit. We should think about people's present and future and about taking care of them so that they will develop merit. Okay? In the monastery, the Reverend Master Jiyu did a talk one time on the Four Wisdoms, and she linked each of the Four Wisdoms with one of the officers of the monastery. For instance, generosity, well, that's linked with the treasurer. The treasurer wants to have the mind of generosity. The novice master wants to have tender speech. You don't want to run off monks. Okay? Novice master is continually teaching. What needs to be done as a parent would. Okay? Benevolence is connected with the prior, who's the chief administrator officer. The prior is the one that sees that things get done and is continually trying to match up the needs in the monastery with the not qualities, but the characteristics of the person, the potential of the person, the capacity of the person. Who do we have on hand who can work in the kitchen this morning? If you've ever talked to one of our priors, it's just this continual, because things are always shifting. It's like on a ship, you're sailing and you never know what the next wave is going to bring or the next wind is going to bring. It's always changing. So the prior is really in the hot seat continually, even on rest days. We just had a rest day where something went wrong with the phones. We had to call the prior. The buck stops with the prior. Okay. The prior acts for the abbess. The prior is the person who tries to see that what the abbess would like done happens. Okay? And it's one of those places where the phrase is, where the rubber meets the road. Okay? How can we make this happen? How can we make this happen? And that's benevolence. Okay? Taking care of beings. Finding wise ways to help them practice. Finding wise ways that will bring good to their lives. It's not being a do-gooder. Okay? Because again, you have to think of what are the long-term consequences of a particular action. The fourth wisdom is empathy or sympathy. I can remember learning very early on the phrase, some of you may have learned it too, walk a mile in another's shoes. I think at that time it was walk a mile in another person's moccasins. Okay, it came out of Native American teaching. This wisdom identifies with others. And again, this is the wisdom that's connected with the abbess, because she has to identify with every person in the monastery. Every monk, every lay person who comes, she has to feel what they're feeling and respond in an appropriate way. Okay? She has to identify with each person who comes. And we can do the same. Okay? It's one of the four wisdoms. It's one of the ways that we practice the Bodhisattva way, is identifying with others, understanding where they're coming from. Walk a mile in their shoes. Dogen, in that chapter, the Shobo Genzo, says that doji, that's the Japanese word, means not to differentiate self from others. Okay? This wisdom also often is explained as helping people work together. Okay? How do we lubricate a society so that people will work together? Okay. One of the books I think a lot of is Karen Armstrong's The Great Transformation. She's a woman who writes on religious history. And one of the points she makes, her theory, but I think it's probably accurate, is that all the great teachers, the Buddha, Lao Tzu, Confucius, Jesus, Muhammad, they all arise about the same time in history. And they all are teaching compassion. They're all teaching some form of the Golden Rule. And her thesis is that society was breaking down. There was so much violence. Literally, all these civilizations were just collapsing. And what these teachers taught, all of them, was to care about someone outside the tribe, to care about someone outside the clan. It's one thing to love the people who love you, or that agree with you. But can we reach out and identify with the people that we disagree with? Can we reach out and agree with the people that we dislike? Okay? Can we identify with them? Can we reach out? Can we put ourselves in their shoes and understand things from their point of view? Okay? That's empathy. Okay? That's one of the four wisdoms. I think this is also expressed in the wedding vow, where the two people promise to make each other a success. Okay, that's the Bodhisattva aspiration. Make everybody a success. How do I make everybody a success? Okay. I want to end with just a couple thoughts on how Dogen looked at the four wisdoms, or at least how we look at them in contemporary Soto Zen or serene reflection. One is that they counterbalance the contemplative practice. Okay? Meditation isn't just for ourselves. Yes, we sit. We sit by ourselves, okay? But our practice isn't limited to that sitting. It's not limited to that meditation, okay? We move out from that and practice the four wisdoms. We're active. It's the active part of Soto Zen. Okay? The contemplation, meditation is the internal, turning within. The four wisdoms is the turning without. And we need that balance. Again, the balance of wisdom and compassion. The other thing I think that Dogen brings out, or at least how we look at it and how I look at it, and I think this would be true, is that these qualities are expressions of our true nature. Okay? They're not something that we're trying to put upon something else. They're not something that we're trying to use just to manipulate situations. But they come from the heart. Okay? They come from our own Buddha nature. We are all naturally generous. We all are naturally kind. We find these qualities within ourselves. We don't pull them out of thin air. Okay? So they come from within. Okay? They're not just an external means for getting things the way we want, even if we're right. Okay, they come from within. And in this way, I think, to use a phrase of Reverend Master G used, it's one of the ways we sanctify the mundane. Okay? We take the nuts and bolts of everyday life and we turn them into spiritual practice. Okay? We take the nuts and bolts of working and living with other people, and in that way we sanctify the mundane, because we live in the mundane. We live in the world. Someone asked, well, the senior teachers about why we meditate with our eyes open, and he said, "It's so you can see." Okay? We live in the world with our eyes open. And the four wisdoms are the way that we can respond to the world from our own true nature. So I'll leave it there today, and it's good to see you all. Thanks those of you who came for the retreat or just for the morning. And may you all be well.